Hey, welcome back to Matt's Garage DIY. Today, we're going to be rebuilding an Argo transmission. So the transmission we have today is from a 1991 Argo Magnum, 2-speed as well as reverse. I believe this is categorized or classified as a Gen 1 transmission, and I think they used those from roughly 1980 till about 2000. If you have some better details, certainly post that in the comments as far as some of those specific gear models. But basically, if you're getting into one of those transmissions, or if you have an Argo in that age range, what we're going to do in this video should pretty much cover everything that you're going to run into with that. So there's a little closer look at the transmission. This is the condition I got it in. Unfortunately, somebody had already started to take it apart and then left it open in the rain. So basically the casing just filled up with water. So I've got some surface rust on the gears and whatnot. But this is what we've got to work with. So I've had a hard time finding any videos or instructions specifically relating to the earlier generation transmissions. So I'm going to work through it. So certainly, as you're watching this video, if you have any tips, tricks, etc. From your experience that makes things a little easier, share that in the comments, and then I will try to update that in the description just so that it can help everybody out. Because hey, that's why we're doing this. As we get into this, just a little closer look at some of the damage inside. So you can see the idler gear has been nicely rounded off, and the meshing or matching gear there is also showing some of that same damage. So that's probably what led to somebody initially pulling this apart. Let's get into the process. So if your disc brakes are still on, you'll want to remove those. That is a 14 mil wrench. You need to take those off the ends of the shaft so we can do the rebuild. I don't have an instruction manual, so I'm going to try to pay specific attention to how everything comes off, and even as far as like how the washers are stacked and things like that. This actually looks like it's coming off not too bad. I'm going to put a puller on there to pull that out. You just want to make sure you don't damage the thread inside when you do that. But already seems like it's not going to take too much effort to get that off, so I'll just use a gear puller. Just pull this assembly right off. All right, with shafts freed up or cleared up for working, next up you want to drain any oil that's in your case out of it. One thing I just want to point out right at the beginning here, so like I mentioned, I already got this transmission in pieces. Some of it I'm actually putting back together now that I have all the parts. There was parts that were missing, parts that need to be replaced. The case had already been split, and the Planetary gear assembly in the middle had been taken apart. So I'm just in the process of kind of putting that back together and then working through how to actually take this apart. Time to separate the case. So there's a total of 8 bolts around the outside that need to come out. Once those are out, there are also snap rings on each output shaft from either end. This one was already missing, but you need a pair of snap ring pliers. Pop that off. Then you can start to work on separating the case. To do that, I'm taking a sort of a wide or large flat blade screwdriver, just kind of starting at a corner. Gently start to tap that in. You are dealing with an aluminum case, so you don't want to damage that. It starts to separate, and then I'm just going to kind of work my way around the sides, kind of working this bearing off of the shaft. As you can see, got a good 1/4 inch already. So I'm just going to kind of keep working my way around. You may want to start using something that's a little thicker or wider of a wedge, but again, just take your time. You don't want to be damaging your case. Just keep working that front half of the case off. Something that I found helped at this stage, I started working 2 wedges on each side, as close as I can to the shaft, but opposite from each other, just to try to make sure that that's coming off straight. Now that I've got about a 1/2 inch gap, I can get my fingertips in there. Just keep working that the rest of the way off. Case is separated. Now for the other side, the snap ring still is in place. So I'm just going to use some snap ring pliers. Spread that, lift it off. I'm going to drive the shaft back through. That's going to push the whole Planetary gear assembly out the other side. Again, you want to be careful you're not damaging the thread or the end of this, so use a block of wood, rubber mallet, something like that, and then start pushing that back through the bearing. All right, it's got a little bit. I think I am going to have to switch to a block of wood though. Starting to make a bit of progress. So what I've done, I've actually just used probably like a 1 inch thick piece of hardwood, bracing the bottom of the case against something solid. Just make sure that right on this side, whatever you're using to sort of kind of used as a backstop, is not going to interfere with the planetary gear as that assembly starts to move out. So with that in place, now I use my block of wood on the other side and a hammer. I'm able to start driving that through. Moving slow, a bunch more hits, and I will have that out the other side. So you can see now the planetary gear is starting to protrude out the far side. It's about a ½ inch out. Kind of once the gear started moving, it is actually going pretty good. So tap this a few more times. And we can take that assembly right out. Now with each half of the case, you're left with an outer and inner bearing, a seal in between, and a snap ring. To get these bearings out, basically I'm just going to use a screwdriver, goes all the way through to catch this edge of the bearing, like that. Start driving that out with a hammer, kind of working my way around to evenly push this bearing out the other side. Just using a rubber mallet for this. Just make sure that you're catching the opposite bearing. Work back and forth a little bit. You can see that bearing is already starting to come out. So I'll just finish pushing this bearing out. I'll repeat that same process for the inner bearing. Again, now working from the outside in to drive that out. You do need to keep in mind you have a snap ring in the middle, so you can't push anything all the way through. With the outer bearing removed, you can see the snap ring and seal on the inside. I actually find this seal is a little bit in the way to kind of drive the bearing out the backside. So I'm going to take the snap ring out, and then I'm going to push attempt to push both the seal and bearing out the backside together. All right, important learning moment for me. There's actually 2 snap rings inside, one on either side, both front and back of the seal. So you cannot press the seal and the inner bearing out together, out the bottom. Again, I had to use the screwdriver and hammer method, tap that inner bearing out, kind of working my way all around. Then you can remove this last snap ring. Seeing as we're already working with the smaller half of the case, or the cover as I'll call it, there are 2 frost plugs as well. Those are both also held in place with some snap rings. Pull those snap rings out, and then you can drive those covers out from the inside out. Snap ring out. I'm just going to drive this frost plug out. There you go. Frost plug out. One more to go. This half of the case is done. All right, so I've kind of reassembled the gear selection assembly. That was all kind of in pieces when I got this, a couple pieces missing, but got that back in place. Something that I discovered as I started to put this back together, so there's a bearing here, there should be another bearing on there. Those will both match up with sort of like the 2 knockout, or these 2 frost plugs. So you're going to have the bearing, snap ring, frost plug type assembly for both of those. So now as we look at the gear assembly, all the way over this way will be reverse. So as I turn that input shaft, of course it's not engaging very well because I have no reverse teeth left on that. I'll just slide that over so it engages. Slide this into a neutral position. You can turn the input shaft, no gear turns. The low range gear, put that in. Getting about 2.5 rotations of the input shaft to the output shaft. And then we slide that all over to the high range. Not quite, but almost a 1-to-1. It's about 1 to 7/8 of a rotation. So anyways, that's the gear assembly. I will take a couple pictures of that and put some thumbnails in beside this, but that is what your gear assembly looks like. And then these all just pull out the side. So to remove the idler gear, which is this bottom gear, should be a small snap ring around the end of that. There is no snap ring as well. The bushing is very badly worn out. Once that snap ring's off, this gear slides out the side. Next, we're going to use a gear puller to remove this bearing and the helical gear behind it. This gear in the back interacts with the large gear that's on the end of that planetary gear setup. Puller is in place. It's time to start cranking. So pulling off this helical gear and bearing is a little bit of a process for sure. And my jaws keep slipping off the bottom. So basically what I'm doing now is I'll put some tension on it, get it to hold in place, and then tap on the end of the top end of the puller. Tighten the puller back up. Put it back under tension. Tap on the top again. Not going to be coming off at a record pace, but when I take this out, you can see I've now pulled the gear and bearing off almost a quarter of an inch. So I'm just going to keep working through that process. But that is what I'm having to do this. You just want to be super careful that you don't end up damaging that helical gear during this process. So that actually only took about another minute or two to get the bearing off. Now that the bearing is off and I'm just pulling the gear, it is coming off much easier. Now I need to disengage this little piece right here. That's basically your shift selector, kind of rides on this large gear. With the helical gear and idler gear out of the way, I can just shift all the way up to reverse. It'll actually go past, and then the two disengage. At that point, this double gear slides right off. Now I can drive the input shaft straight through. There's a bearing right here that's still seated in, so I'm just going to drive that through. In this case, the bearing came out with it. Now that I've taken the gears off this shaft, I actually have no way to pull it out of the bearing that's at the very back. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually tap the bearing back onto the front, and I'm going to use a slide hammer and pull this shaft out. Alternatively, you could drill a hole through the frost plug on the back side, tap the shaft out. You want to make sure you've got a replacement frost plug if you're doing that. But I'm going to put a bearing on and then just use a slide hammer to get that out. Bearing is on. Time for the slide hammer. There we go. Now I can just use a puller to take the two bearings off the end. Obviously you don't want it flying across the shop, kind of the way mine did, but got it out. So nearly done disassembly. We need to take out this little shaft that the idler gear runs on, little snap ring at the back. Pop that snap ring off. This shaft will just slide right out. Then in the back of the case, one more frost plug with a snap ring and the input shaft seal and snap ring. So pop those two snap rings out, and then you can just drive the frost plug out and drive the seal out. Inside of the case is then basically done. Last thing we'll look at is removing the handle from the top. All right, so we've got this handle or shift lever on the top. Two split pins there that you need to drive out. Just drive those through with a punch. You can separate the top part of the shift lever from the bottom part that's inside the case. So case is laying down. You can see the pins protruding out the bottom. So I am using a, what size is that? It's like a 1/8 punch. Both pins are out. Top half of the shift lever slides off. Spin that around and look inside. Now this whole shift mechanism, I have to wiggle a little, it's a little dirty and grimy, but slides right back through. And give that a little bit of a tap on the outside. See, now I'm getting ahead of myself. Should have taken this idler shaft out first, because now as I try to drive this out, it's actually hitting against the idler shaft. Snap ring and idler shaft are off. Now I can finish driving this lever through. If you need to change this piece, again, just another little snap ring on top. I don't need to do that. I'm going to leave this together. but if you do need to take it off, just that little snap ring and then this kind of little cog that rides on the gear will pop right off. So we're almost done the case disassembly. The last part of the case itself is this bushing that goes through the top. This is for the shift lever. If that's not worn out, you don't necessarily need to replace it. I have a replacement bushing here. I've measured the outside, so that is 16 millimeters on the outside. So you're going to need to press this out, whether you have, an actual set of, kind of correct bearing and bushing presses. In this case, I'm going to find something that fits or that works. This measures 16 millimeters. So I'm going to find something just under 16 millimeters that still kind of catches the edge of that. Set that in there. You can either then use a hammer to drive this out, or I'm going to use a press and press that bearing out the bottom. All right, so I brought my case over to the press. I've got a 7/16 nut driver socket. I measured the outside of that. It is about 1 millimeter smaller, or 15 millimeters outside diameter. So I'm going to put that in there, sort of center that on the bushing, and then we're going to push this out. All right, I've got the press set. I've checked my clearance all around, making sure that whatever I'm using to press the bushing out is not going to catch the edge of the case. And I'll just start pushing that through. You can see the bushing coming out the bottom of the case as I continue to press that through. So I'm just going to continue all the way down until that bushing comes out the bottom. Last part of the disassembly is the Planetary gear assembly. You see the face of the large gear, there's 3 cap screws, 1/4 inch Allen key. Take those out. Now we have this housing that we need to separate. We've got a bunch of shafts into bushings. That's what's really holding this together right now. Top it with a rubber mallet. The 2 halves separate. Now we pull off all of these intermediary gears. There should be 6 in total. Set those aside. And then you'll see on each half, there's a smaller gear and a spring clip. Take these spring clips off, take those gears off. Gear slides off. There's a bearing inside. That won't just slide off, so I'll probably just going to hammer this through. Just tapping on the face. You can see that shaft is going all the way through, out the other side. Now for the second half, again, spring clip. This is quite corroded. It may not come off quite so easily in my case. But again, spring clip off. Yeah, there we go. Gear comes off. I'm going to drive this through. All right, learned from my mistake on this. I got a little bit hasty, started hammering on that right away. I should have used a block of wood or sort of a punch that would stay centered in this. I did ever so slightly flare the end of this shaft. So I've just had to tap the bearing back off, touch that up with a file just to remove that. Even the slightest sort of flaring at that end will make it almost impossible to get this bearing off. So take your time, use a block of wood, use a drift or something that's going to stay centered on that, and then you can pound that bearing off, or pound the shaft through the bearing. So still working on this back half of the Planetary assembly. Not sure how well you can see that, but the bearing has actually sort of come out of the pocket that it seats in and is just kind of stuck on the end of the shaft. In some ways that makes things easier. I'm just using a gear puller now to pull the bearing off the end of the shaft, and then the entire assembly will separate. To remove the bearing out of this sort of the large gear on the Planetary assembly, you can see there's a solid back. There is no way to press that through. What I've had to do, basically again using a screwdriver at an angle, putting it across, catching the lip of the bearing, and then just tapping it with a hammer. I just gave it one light tap and it's already coming out. So it's not a super tight fit, but you will have to sort of drive from the backside, working that screwdriver around to press that out evenly. That's how you get the bearing out. That only took probably 6 or 7 taps with a hammer and screwdriver to get that bearing out. Final step of the disassembly, I have both halves of the Planetary gear assembly here. In each half, there's a total of 6 bushings, 12 in total. These bushings are slightly bigger. These ones measure to about 17 millimeters. I will put the imperial conversion on there. Anyways, I have gone to a slightly larger nut driver to push these ones out. I just needed to find one that sort of matched that size closer. Just a hair under. This is a 1/2 inch nut driver. Whatever brand of sockets that you're using, again, you want to make sure that you're using the right type or the right size. So we're going to put that in there, push the last bushing out of each half, and then we're done. Here's all the parts and pieces laid out. Just got to clean these all up. There are 3 gears that I'm replacing. This one, this edge of the tooth has been very badly worn off. Also matching up with the idler gear that has had the teeth very badly worn. So replacing both of those. This shaft, unfortunately, as I got into it, these teeth have all been badly rounded, kind of beyond what I think is going to be usable. And then the only other new part will be this gear. This was actually completely missing from the transmission that I bought. So transmission's all cleaned up. Time to put it back together. Okay, we're going to put this back together in reverse order. So we're going to start by pressing all the bushings back in. As you can see, there's a slight taper that helps you to get the bushings centered. They are thinner than the gear overall. So the top edge of the bushing will be pushed all the way down to the bottom of the bevel. There's bevels on both sides. That will help you to correctly place that bushing side to side. So first bushing's in. As you can see, slightly below the surface. When I flip this over to the back side, try to show you on an angle again, slightly below the surface, you can see the bevel just in behind it. That's what you're looking for. We're just going to finish pushing the other 6 in on this, and then the same for the other half of the Planetary gear, and our bushings are in. As we start to put the Planetary gear assembly, first thing that we're going to do now that the bushings are in, we're going to put these 2 large bearings. We're going to press those onto the 2 outside halves. Those bearings, once the assembly is in place or together, will then get pressed in to the case on either side. Any of the bearings that we're going to be pressing on, we're just going to be putting a little coat of Never Seize on ahead of time just to help those seat together. Okay, outer bearings are on. Now we are going to press the bearings onto the inner half of the differential. 1 at each. 1 there. And 1 there. Before you press the bearing in, you want to make sure that it's straight. As you can see in this case, the bearing is a little crooked. Now we're going to install our drive shafts, 1 in each half. We're going to start like that. Splines will be towards the center of the Planetary or differential. I'm going to put that through the outer, and then we'll finish pressing that through the bearing on the inside. Once that's on, then there will be a gear and spring clip as well. As we're pressing both halves onto the shaft, we've got this part way through. We're now going to put our gear on, like this. Finish pressing that on. With the gear, you'll notice there's a large shoulder and a small shoulder. Large shoulder goes towards the center. So we've pressed the gear on as well, or pressed the shaft through and then pushed the gear down. You can see there's a little groove there. So we're going to put a snap ring in there. We've pushed this a little bit too far, but after that snap ring is on, then we'll just tap this shaft back, making sure that the gear and snap ring are tight. As we get ready to assemble the two halves of the Planetary gear, we've got a bunch of gears that look like this. One going low, next one going high, and by that I mean gear on the bottom, gear on the top. As I work my way around, I just make sure that I keep the sequence the same. So as I move to the next one, again, low, high, low, and high. I'm going to put a little drop of oil in each of these as we start to assemble that. And we're going to put this top half on. This gear will need to mesh with these top gears, and all of these posts will go through the bushings in the top. Then we'll put the cap screws on and tighten it up. We got this together. You can see everything's working well. I'll list the torque specs for these cap screws on the screen. Your Planetary gear assembly is now together. Now it's time to install our Planetary gear assembly into the case. The smaller end, or the end without the ring gear, is going to be going in. So if you take a look inside, you'll see there's sort of 3 flat surfaces, 2 grooves. So as we put this back together, inner bearing, snap ring, seal, snap ring, outer bearing. So just taking a look at the shaft, I already have the inner bearing on. Then there will be the snap ring, the seal, the next snap ring, and the final bearing. All of that, when it's pressed together, will be down on this portion right here. When you're putting the seal on, you'll see there's a flat side and sort of a concave side, and there's a small exposed spring. Concave side in towards your gear assembly. Putting the first snap ring in on the inner groove, and then I will press the Planetary assembly in using that snap ring as a stop for this bearing. After that, the seal, the next snap ring, and the final bearing will all be installed from the outside of the case, pushing in. These snap rings are quite large. My snap ring pliers were not big enough, so I ended up taking a pair of needle nose. I did have to taper the end ever so slightly on my bench grinder, but now I'll be able to use that to put these large snap rings in. Just taking a look inside the housing, you can now see that snap ring is seated on the inside groove. I'm ready to press the Planetary assembly in. Make sure that your shaft is vertical, your bearing is starting into the case correctly. I would recommend that even after your first couple presses or pushes with the press, that you stop, double check that everything is going in square. This is an aluminum case, so there is a chance of kind of pushing that or pressing that in crookedly if you're using a lot of force. You just want to make sure that you're doing this correctly. So of course I forgot to hit record as I pressed that in. As I started putting some downward pressure on this, I did see the assembly tip ever so slightly. Basically, the bearing sort of self-aligned itself as I put a bit of pressure in it. And believe me, when I say moved slightly, I'm talking like a 1/16 of an inch, that sort of a shift. If you're really crooked, this is not going to center itself. You're just going to end up wrecking the housing on the bottom side. But push this in. I've now made contact with the spring clip on the bottom. I'm going to flip this over, put the seal in, the other spring clip, and the final bearing. Just taking a quick look from the other side. As you can see, bearing is pressed in, touching the spring clip. Easiest, I find at least, easiest to check where the end of the spring clip is and the surface of the bearing. Look in there with a flashlight. If you can see any gap, you need to push that bearing in just a little bit further just to make sure that you've got some contact. Time for the seal. Make sure that you put some oil on the inside of the seal. I'm actually going to put a little bit around the outside as well just to help that slide in there. But you want to be very careful that you don't damage the lips on this inside area. Then the seal is actually quite soft. It's not a tin seal, it's all rubber. So I'm going to sort of work that over the shoulder of the shaft and then start pressing that in. Okay. Seal is ready to start. I'm going to begin by using this piece of hardwood I have with a hole drilled through the middle, place that over top, and then just work in a circular pattern around, hammering that down basically until the seal is down flush with the shoulder. At that point, then I'll have to move to the race, which is slightly smaller, and then start working inside. So tapping the seal in worked great until I got to the second snap ring groove. The seal's getting hung up on that a little bit. So what I've done now, I took one of the old bearings, ground down the outside and the inside, drops in, doesn't bind on the case, doesn't bind on the shaft. Now I'll be able to use a socket, put some pressure on that, and push that seal in the rest of the way. Seal and snap ring are in place. Outer bearings on, ready to go. Did put a little never sees on the inside and outside of that. Again, I'm going to use my ground down bearing. It's a bit of a spacer, put that over top. And my socket to press that into place. I'm just going to press this down until it makes contact with that snap ring. All right, outer bearing is in. I just pressed that down until it was flush with this face. Shaft turns nice and freely. On to the next part. Next, I'm going to install the bushing in the top of the case and the shift lever. After that, I'm going to put in the idler shaft. If you note on the idler gear shaft, this was the original shaft. This is the replacement shaft that came with the rebuild kit. The grooves for the snap rings do not line up. I suspect that's because this shaft was made for some of the newer models and there may be a slight difference in the case or the casting. I'm going to be reusing my original shaft. It's not worn. I've tried the gear on it. Fits nice and snug. Just something to keep in mind when you're putting this back together. We've got the bushing in the top of the case. I did give it just a little quick coat of oil. I've got my socket that I'm going to drop in again. Use that to press this down. I'm going to press this down until the top of the bushing is flush with the top of the case. The shift lever is now in place. I've fed that from the inside of the case, working it up. Time for the idler gear shaft. As you'll note, there's what I'll call a small end and a large end, just basically the distance from the end of the shaft to the snap ring. From what I can see on the parts diagram, the big end goes in first. I did oil this shaft ahead of time, slide that through. Now you have to reach in and put the snap ring on the back. Next, I'm going to install the input shaft. That shaft goes in up here. Back in the hole, again, you can see there's a snap ring groove, so I'm going to put the snap ring in, press the bearing in, and then push the shaft into that. Snap ring is in place. At the same time that I'm putting the bearing on the inside, I'm just going to put the seal on the outside as well. Pressing this bearing in certainly will be a bit of a challenge because you're now working deep inside the case. While I'm at it, I am also going to press this bearing in so that I'm not trying to then work around the input shaft and have even less space to press that bearing in. Both bearings are now pressed in and tight to the snap rings. Now I'm just going to put the seal in, and then I can press that input shaft in. I'm not going to press this frost plug in yet. I will do those at the end of the assembly. As I get ready to press the shaft in, I see I have some very tight clearances, both right here. The teeth are basically touching the bottom of the shift lever. And then over in this area, I need to make sure that those teeth do not catch this piece of the aluminum housing right there as I press that in. There's a little bit of an aside, but I want to point this out before we go any further. As I mentioned before, this is the shaft that the idler gear slides back and forth in. As you notice, that shaft can push in very easily. So after the idler gear is in and we have finished all the rest of the assembly and I put the case on, I'm concerned that if I push or bump this at all, it's going to go back inside the case. I won't be able to put on the snap ring that is snapped outside of the case with no way to put that on. So what I've done, kind of made this up ahead of time and checked that it fits. I've just taken a little bit of threaded rod and made a hook that I can fish through the oil drain, or the oil fill on top. Tested this out. Basically, you're going to need to fish that in and then be able to push that rod back. So again, if your idler shaft gets bumped in while you're doing your sort of final assembly and putting the case on, you'll want to make a piece that you know ahead of time will fit, kind of reach that shaft, and you can use to push it over. Now for the double gear and forward reverse slash speed selector shaft. A couple things to point out with this. So Argo made a bit of a design change right around 1990. So 90 and earlier, or approximately 90 and earlier, your shaft is going to look like this. These dimples in the bottom valley, and then a smooth portion of the shaft on the end that your helical gear slides onto with some keys. After that, they changed the design, so the dimples are now on top of the rib. These fins carry all the way to the end, and the gear that goes on no longer uses keys like this one, but actually matches sort of the spline that is cut into that. So be aware if you're ordering parts of that change. Now, where I ran into problems is that after the change, they switched the gear. There is a hole drilled through the gear that you drop this little spring and ball into. That spring and ball interacts with these dimples, helping to lock the gear into, or helping to lock the double gear into place. Then it'll actually take some pressure to have it snap into neutral, reverse, to high gear, that sort of thing, rather than the gear just being able to slide freely. But because the dimples have been moved from what I'll call the valley to the ridge of the spline, the old gear matches the valley, the new gear matches the ridge. So you have two choices. One, order a new shaft and new helical gear. Or two, you can do what I did and drilled new holes in the rib so that I was able to use my helical gear, use the shaft, and I only had to get the double gear. There are not two double gears available. You can only get the new gear that matches the holes on the top of the rib or the top of the spline. So those are sort of your options. I just wanted to point that out right now. So to assemble your double gear and shaft, you have this spring and ball. Drop the spring through first, or you can do it from the inside. There is a matching hole on the opposite side, so you want the spring to go into that first, and then the ball on top. That will then interact with all of these. To put this together, now if you have a shaft like mine, you will want to use the small end of the shaft will be at the same side as the small gear. Depress your little ball inside, ball and spring inside. You want to make sure that's going to line up with these dimples. And then you start putting that together. There you go. And you can see it does take some pressure to switch gears. And then as I push it, you can hear that snap into the next gear. At this point, this is ready to install. There's actually one more piece. You still have to put the helical gear on this. On the older style shafts, there's two of these keys that fit in on either side. And then the helical gear will drop on. Make sure that the keys are lined up. Press that together. With the newer shaft, my understanding is that these splines run all the way to the end, so you should be able to just slide that helical gear on. Also be aware, on one side of the helical gear there is a shoulder. When I flip it over, you see there is no shoulder. The shoulder side goes out and will be closest to the bearing. This assembly is now ready to install. Before I install the speed select shaft, I've actually pulled the cap screws back out of this side of the Planetary gear assembly, and I'm going to slide that out. That's just going to give me some more room to work inside. Tip this up a little bit. You have your gears up in the top that your speed select gears are going to need to interact with. You need to make sure you're getting that all lined up as you've pushed this into place. So I think that's going to be easier with the one half of the Planetary gear assembly removed. So this final shaft is ready to press in place. I've got it set there. It's level, and you also want to make sure that your gears, this large gear, is lined up with the small gear on your input shaft. The teeth have kind of lined up, so now I'm good to start pressing that together. One more thing to point out before I actually press that together, don't forget to get your shift select lever onto the large gear. If you press this all together beforehand, I don't believe that you're going to be able to get this little selector riding on the large gear. So again, teeth lined up, selector on, shaft level, press it together. Before you finish buttoning this up, you're going to want to make sure that all your gears are working. See, I'm in reverse. We'll just temporarily put my handle on top, into neutral. Oops. First gear, or low gear. And then all the way over into high gear. So you want to make sure that that's all working. Obviously this kind of moves around a little bit because it's not bolted down to anything as I shift back and forth between the gears. But I'm happy with the way that all is. And now I'm just going to put the other half of the Planetary gear back on. It's going to be a little trick. You know, I got to kind of line it up with this helical gear as well as all the rest of that. But we'll get that all lined up, put it together, and then we can put the other half on. All right, time to reassemble the Planetary gear. Again, remember that you've got the 6 bushings in the large gear that need to line up with the 6 smaller shafts. You have a gear on the inside of the Planetary that needs to line up with those teeth. And then the helical gear on the outside needs to line up with this helical gear. Fortunately, this spins freely, so that will give you a little bit of fine-tuning adjustment. I'm going to focus primarily on getting this part lined up first. Wow, that almost made it look too easy. I'm going to reinstall these cap screws, torque them all up. I would say the hardest part is now done. So with everything finally installed, I'm just going to do one final check through all the gears. I've given all the gears a coat of oil as well. So we got reverse, neutral, first, and high. As I get ready to finish the cover of the case, I'm going to put the 3 snap rings in. 2 small snap rings for each of these holes. And then again, in this bottom one, you can see there's the 2 grooves, so there'll be 2 snap rings, so bearing, seal, bearing. So I'm going to put the inner snap ring in only at this point. I'm going to do the 2 snap rings on the top and press those bearings in. I'm going to put the case together, and then after the case is together, I'll put this seal, the snap ring, and the final bearing in. Bolts have been torqued, final check done on the gears, everything seems to be working correctly, time to put this together. It does present sort of a final challenge. I have these 2 bearings that need to be pressed onto those 2 shafts, and then this bearing that needs to be pressed into that hole in the housing. Definitely going to be a little bit of a struggle. I did see one person do something like that with just a large C-clamps. I'm going to try to use maybe some clamps and my press in combination. But we'll see how it goes. But first off, clean those surfaces, and then we will put some gasket maker and a gasket on there. At this point, I have put in a bunch of the bolts that hold the 2 halves of the case together. I've just put these all in finger tight at this point. That's more just to help keep everything aligned and to keep this cover from shifting or falling off while I'm working with it. We've got the transmission in the press. I'm going to start by putting some pressure down on this part of the casing, 1 or 2 pumps after contact is made. Then I'll switch over and do the same over here. I think I'm just going to have to kind of work back and forth between the 2, just making sure that one part doesn't get too far ahead of the other. So the case is back together. As you saw, just carefully work this and then back to those. It is a little bit of fooling around, but it actually worked really well, much better than I expected. Got the bolts in. You have to torque those up. I will put the torque spec for that. So I have now also finished pushing this little rod through. Making this little hook that I talked about earlier was definitely the key. Ended up having to put that in, kind of put a bunch of pressure on the rod, and then just gently tap on the face to get that to pop through. you'll certainly want to have something like that ready ahead of time. Make sure that it works, just so you're going to be able to get that piece on in the final little snap ring. So last thing to do, I'm going to put in the seal, the last snap ring, and the final bearing. Seal and snap ring are in. Time to press in the final bearing. Last up is the frost plugs or caps. I'm going to put them in sort of smooth side out. I'm just worried that if I put them in this way, although they would drive in easier that way, they're going to end up rubbing on the end of the shaft. So I'm going to put them in this way. Just use a rubber mallet, tap those into place. There we go. One more here, one more on the other side. Transmission's done. All right, so there you have it. Rebuilding your Argo Gen 1 transmission, start to finish. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like I mentioned at the beginning, kind of working this through without any instructions. So if you have any tips, tricks, whatnot, please share that in the comments. Click that like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.